Hello, I'm Dr. Adrian Marsh, and my lecture is about Romani identity, Romani history, and Romani historiography. To begin with, I want to look at Romani identity. The history of Romani identity is an extremely complex and contested one. Identity itself is complex and contested, especially in the modern world. And to begin with, it's worth saying that all identities, all modern identities, are constructed. They are all made up of composites. They are all made up of elements that come together to form notions of nationhood, of human collectivity, of belongingness, and of group within and without, those inside the group boundary and those outside the group boundary. This is true of English identity or Swedish identity or modern Italian identity as much as it's true of Romani identity. And similarly to English identity and Swedish identity and many European identities, Romani identity comes together, coalesces around the same time in the middle of the 11th century. So what are the components of Romani identity? Well, we might suggest that culture is a major component. The way that people within a group all agree upon doing things, how they get married, how they bury grandmother, what they do about cleanliness, how they view people within the group as opposed to people without the group. Language is another big marker when it comes to identity. And Romani identity is very specific about Romani language and its many dialects in the world. One language, but with many dialects. Another aspect of identity is beliefs. Shared beliefs amongst a commonality, amongst a human group. And when it comes to beliefs, there are a variety of beliefs encompassed within Romani identity. And not just religious beliefs in the sense of Christianity, or of Islam, or even of Judaism, but other kinds of beliefs about origins, beliefs about journeys, beliefs about stories of the past. These are an important part of any identity, and in the case of Romani people, they perform a particular function, which is to unite across a series of very, very far-flung and disparate groups. Following on from ideas about unity and commonality, we have beliefs around common origin, and these are particularly important. And in the most recent times, what we've seen a wide-scale acceptance of the idea of Romani people originating in north-central and northwestern India, historically going back to the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries. So these ideas about collective beginnings have become even more important in modern Romani identity as we see Romani communities connecting across the globe, from Latin America, North America, Canada, Europe, parts of the Middle East, into the Eastern world. Now, despite the prevalence of notions of biological difference, of separateness, the idea that the human community in general is separated out into different groups on the basis of what has traditionally been called race, there is actually no foundation in that. Human beings are one species, are one race. Differences between groups of human beings are dependent upon location, environment, language, culture, traditions, beliefs. These kind of things are what makes up the differences and how groups define themselves vis-à-vis other groups. So there may be an attractiveness about the idea of one blood, one people, one nation, but in actuality there is no scientific basis for such a thing. DNA testing has shown that human populations, of course, reflect their environments on migration or journey as they move through continents, as they move across seas, as they mix with other populations. But these are not the same as to say that one group of human beings is a different race from another. And in the context of beliefs about race and biology, racial science, as developed in the late 19th century through eugenics and into the early 20th century in the Scandinavian lands and in the German lands, has caused more death and destruction for Romani people than any other single factor. So when it comes to discussions about what is intrinsically Romani, we need to come away from ideas which essentialize people and populations, particularly Romani populations, as they have become the basis on which many nationalists and fascists have discriminated, persecuted, and even carried out genocide. Romani history is a complex, contested, and constructed series of ideas about what has happened in our past, in the past of Romani people, who has influenced that past, where we've come from, where we've been, and where we are going. History is in many ways ethnicity. To establish one's history as a legitimate authoritative narrative is to establish one's ethnicity. And we can see this in modern Greek ethnicity, in modern Turkish ethnicity, in modern British ethnicity, or English ethnicity, or Welsh ethnicity. Many countries in Europe build their ethnicity on the basis of a recorded, documented history, which also incorporates a fair degree of myth and common shared assumptions about origins and developments. These are points at which the beginnings of Muslim society and expansion from the Arab lands, from the heartlands of Islam, begin to confront the Indian lands and those who lived within them. The capture of many hundreds of thousands of Indian prisoners, Hindu prisoners, is the basis for much of what we see in modern Romani identities and modern Romani populations, albeit stretched over time and distance by many hundreds of years. The beginnings of modern Romani identity we can see in the ancestry of the northwestern and north-central Indian lands amongst the Hindus who stood to resist Islamic incursions and conquest. As I said, Muslim conquest began in the late 7th, early 8th centuries, with hundreds of Hindus being taken back to Baghdad, to Damascus, to the central lands of the Umayyad Caliphate. The second wave of Muslim incursions into northwestern and north-central India took place some 2 centuries later, when we have Mahmud of Ghazni, who becomes the Sultan of an emirate on the borderlands of Afghanistan, northwestern India, around 997, and he begins a series of razzias, a series of conquest raids into northwestern and north-central India, sometimes quite spectacularly crossing the Thar Desert and other inhospitable territories in order to reach his goals. Now on these razzias he confronted the Rajput kingdoms and their armies, and faced with this kind of resistance, he built up an overwhelming force which was able to defeat them and conquer their lands. The remnants of these defeated Rajput armies were of course captured as slaves and servitors by Mahmud and his forces, taken back to Afghanistan, what was then Ghazni and is now modern Ghazni, and incorporated within the growing state that was the Ghaznavid Empire. These Hindus became part of the personal guard, the Ghulam, slaves, soldiers who were loyal to the Sultan, who could be relied upon to carry out his wishes and his wishes alone. They were often deployed against other Muslim populations or Christian or Jewish populations, the people of the book under Islam, which is prohibited normally by Muslims themselves. So the idea is that you cannot, as a Muslim, fight other Muslims. One should be united as part of the Ummah, the Brotherhood of Islam. However, the use of a personal guard of 6,000 of Hindus to crush rebellion and revolt, as in Nishapur in 1007, when there were riots by Christians and Jews and Muslims against taxes being imposed, the deployment of these ghulam, these Hindu ghulam, allowed Mahmud to impose his will upon these communities of Christians and Jews and Muslims. However, there was resistance to this, and as we can see from chronicles written by people like Al-Tabari, we see a growing resistance to the Ghaznavid imposition of force, particularly amongst what were becoming groups of Seljuk tribesmen, Yurks and Turkmen, originally from Central Asia, who had migrated into Persia, Khorasan and Eastern Anatolia eventually. Now, Mahmud died in 1030, highly successful, having made at least 19 or 20 major raids into the Indian lands. And not only did he bring back a great many captives, slaves, which were sold on the open market or incorporated into the Ghaznavid military machine, but he also brought back enormous amounts of treasure, raiding Hindu temples, bringing away gold and jewels, spices, all kinds of things, which made the Ghaznavid Empire very, very wealthy, but equally very, very attractive for other growing powers to take on. His son, Masud, in 1040, confronted the Seljuks. By this time, by 1040, they had become a major powerful force in the region, and they were unwilling to accept overlordship of the Ghaznavids any longer. And at a place called Dandan Khan, in May 1040, there was a huge battle. Masud and his Ghaznavid army were defeated, and the Ghulam, the Hindu Ghulams, stood to the last person. The Seljuks were able to defeat the Ghaznavids and the Ghulam slave servitors, the soldiers. And what remained of the Ghaznavid forces fled westward after the battle, moving into the eastern Armenian lands, Cilicia, and then finally along the migration routes into what was Constantinople, what is now modern Istanbul. And here, in the remnants of the Ghaznavid Ghulam forces, the people who were left after the soldiers were defeated and killed, the people who raised the tents, the people who baked the bread, the people who were grooms, the people who made the armor, the people who made the arrows, the people who sharpened the swords, in these remnants we find the ancestors of the Romani people. Now, the major route for migration in ancient times, as in modern times, was the one I described earlier. It was along what was the Cilician coast, which is now southern Anatolia, along the Mediterranean and the Aegean, up through the Dardanelles and into Constantinople, the capital of Byzantium. It's important to remember that Byzantium was never called Byzantium by the people who lived there and the people who ruled. They considered themselves to be the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was lived in and governed by Romans, Romioi. And the Roman Empire was what we might translate into modern English as Roman land, Romania. So when we use the term Byzantine, we're actually using a 19th century historical term, which was used by historians then to differentiate the East Roman Empire and the West Roman Empire up until its collapse in about 478, 480. The Romanis arrive in Constantinople and are documented as early as 1050, that's 10 years after the Battle of Dandan Khan, which might seem quite quick in terms of a journey from Transoxiania through to the Bosphorus. But when we look at modern migration, we see people travelling very quickly from Afghanistan through Persia, through Iran, Iraq, Eastern Anatolia, and up into Europe. So these kind of timescales for populations on the move were not perhaps as slow as we tend to think. In 1050, at the court of Constantine Monomachus IX, we find a record of people arriving who are considered to be Sumerians, followers of Simon Magus, magicians themselves, soothsayers, fortune tellers. and people who can carry out magic. Now, these people arrive at the court of Constantine Monomachus, and he gives them a job. He asks them to rid his hunting grounds just outside the walls of Constantinople of wild beasts that are attacking all of his game animals, the deer and others. And he asked the Samarians to clear the hunting grounds of these predators and save his game. This they do, and then they return to the court and they claim a fee. They ask to be paid for the work that they've done. However, the Byzantine court at this time was one which was highly religious in terms of Eastern Orthodoxy, and a famous Georgian saint, St. George of Everon, St. George the Athonite, was present at the court when the Samarians returned, and he condemned them. He condemned them as practices of magic, he condemned them as sorcerers carrying out the devil's work, and he condemned them as Atsinganoi. Now, the Atsinganoi were actually a heretic Christian sect who existed in the Byzantine Empire in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. By the time the Samarians, i.e. the Romani ancestors, arrive in Constantinople, they've become extinct. They've been persecuted and they've been eradicated from Byzantine society. However, St. George of Everon was making an equation with this older heretic Christian group in order to demonstrate that they were inherently evil, they were inherently mistaken in their beliefs. Now, he asked them to demonstrate their power as sorcerers, as magicians. St. George asked them to demonstrate their power as sorcerers and magicians by charming a piece of meat and giving it to a dog, and the dog then died. However, St. George confronted them and said that they were practicing the devil's work and made the sign of the cross over the dog, and the dog was revived, clearly indicating through this story that he was somebody who had the grace of God and could enact on God's behalf miracles, and that the people who he identified as Atsinganoi and Samarians, these people were inherently evil. Later, we find Byzantine records, particularly from the Orthodox Church, telling us about the Atsinganoi as Egyptians, and the Egyptians practicing magic and sorcery, and that anybody who went to consult with the Egyptians was to be penalized, was to be punished by excommunication, usually for a period of years, between 5 and 7 years. The connection with Egypt comes about as a result of Byzantine interest in magic and sorcery. Two major court figures, Michael Sellos, who lived in the 11th century, and Michael Italikos, who lived in the 12th century, were writers on magic. They were scholars who were interested in the ideas behind magic and in the history of magic. These two scholars were interested in the history of magic from Chaldea, ancient Chaldea, into Egypt. And the records in the Bible tell us, of course, that all magic comes from Pharaoh and Egypt is the source of peoples who practice magic. In the middle of the 11th century in Byzantium, there was a great deal of interest in magic and sorcery, mostly magic and sorcery that came from Egypt. And so any groups that practiced magic and sorcery were immediately labelled as coming from Egypt, i.e. Egyptians. And by the middle of the 12th century, this identity had become firmly fixed around the ancestors of Romani people. They became Egyptians long before this label was given to them in Europe. And so the association of magic and Egypt and Romani people was embedded in the East Roman Empire from the 11th century, the middle of the 11th century onwards. Furthermore, throughout the Byzantine Empire, there are records of Egyptians practicing magic, practicing divination, prognostication, sorcery, and bear leading. There are also records of Romanis who were acrobats and tumblers and jugglers. In the middle of the 14th century, we find a high court official recording a group of acrobats who'd arrived in Constantinople all the way from Egypt itself and were on their way to Iberia, to what is now modern Spain. These people had started out as a large group, but gradually, because of the danger of their activities, they'd been whittled down by about half. We also find in a letter from a Byzantine courtier who has been exiled from Constantinople to the Peloponnese, we find the first record of Egyptians as a nation, as a coherent and cohesive group, with a language of their own. They are recorded in Mazaris's letter from hell in 1415. In the 13th century, 100 years earlier, there is a record on Mount Athos, the holy mountain, of a Romani shoemaker. So sporadically, throughout the Byzantine Empire, we find records relating to Romani people as Egyptians, and on into the Balkans, into the Eastern Europe and Central Europe, we also find records of Romani people too. It's from the middle of the 14th century that we first find records of Romani slaves in the Serbian lands, in Wallachia and Moldavia, often being bought and sold by monasteries, by nobles, and by the princes of those lands. So this is the beginning of the period of Romani slavery, which doesn't end until around 1864, in what then becomes the Kingdom of Romania. Thus we have a picture emerging of Romani people. They are a coherent group, identified as Egyptians. There is a series of occupations associated with them: sorcery, prognostication, divination, fortune-telling, bear leading, shoemaking, acrobatics, tumbling, juggling. But interestingly, there is no record of music or dancing for public consumption. So the later association of Romani people in music and dancing clearly comes into its own much later in history, under the Ottomans, when there is a clear link made between music, public performance and dance. In the Byzantine Empire, Romani people are associated with a very small number of occupations, and these are mostly around fortune-telling and magic. In the 15th century onwards, we find Romani people moving into Central Europe, into the German lands, into what's now modern France, and then in the early 16th century into Germany and Scandinavia. So we can see a pattern of migration here, from the very far east Indian lands up until the 16th century, when Romani populations are moving to the furthest edges of the European continent. So this pattern of migration, this pattern of spreading out of Romani populations throughout the European continent, is one that is established really quite fully by the 17th century. Now, what is interesting about all of this is that there are only very, very few occasions when we hear Romani voices as part of the record. What's mostly being recorded are chronicles written by courtiers, or edicts written by churchmen who are banning consulting the Egyptians on penalty of excommunication, or city records where groups of Romani people turn up and ask for permission to stay or permission to pass through the lands, as they do in Hildesheim and in Paris in the early 15th century. We also find records by historians who are trying to collect knowledge about Romani people as Egyptians, as in Scotland at the court of the Scottish kings, and later in Denmark, and then in Finland, and then in Stockholm in Sweden. The occasions when we do hear a Romani voice go back to the middle of the 14th century, actually the late 14th century, 1384. Leonardo di Niccolo Frescobaldi in 1384, along with 12 other Florentines, sets out on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. On the way, the ship stops at Modon in the Epirus on the Greek coast, and there Leonardo notices a group of black tents, and in the black tents he finds Egyptians. When he goes to them, he asks them who they are, one of the very few times when this happens, and the answer he gets surprises him. He's told by the people in the tents that they are Romiti, i.e. they are the sons of the people who ruled Rome, Romioi. Now this, I would argue, and many others would also argue, is the origins of the term Roma. This is the notion of being the sons of the princes, which you find in the English gypsies as Romani Charles. Here we have the origins of Romani. in the sense of the identity of Romani people as Romani, rather than as Egyptians or Sumerians or any of the other epithets that they've been given, like Atsinganoi. And it's important to recognise that that moment in 1384 is the beginnings of a different kind of consciousness, perhaps one of self-awareness, where people are telling others who they are in their own words. We also find an example of language and people speaking in their own words in the 1530s in Elizabethan Oxford, when Andrew Board, Dr. Andrew Board, a physician at the Tudor court, finds a group of Egyptians and sits down and asks them to give him examples of their language, Egypt speech, as he records it. And they give him a list of 50 or 60 words which are recognisable in modern Romanesque. So here we have clear examples of the language becoming a fully fledged, articulated means of communication within the group, and to some extent being recognised as an in-group form of communication, a language in its own right, by scholarship outside of the group. Andrew Board is one of the first examples, but there are others through the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. So this knowledge about language, knowledge about communication, knowledge about in-group identity from outside of the group continues. And it flowers most opportunely in the late 19th century with the formation of the Gypsy Law Society, when groups of scholars come together, beginning in Edinburgh and then throughout Europe, to record what they know, what they understand, what they interpret of Romani, or Gypsy as it's called, Gypsy culture, language, folk stories, history. And the Gypsy Law Society is the basis of modern Romani studies, in the sense it is a scholarly approach, the first attempt of a scholarly approach to objectively try and record culture, traditions, language and practices amongst the Romani people. There had been earlier attempts, and we'll look at those briefly when I start to talk about Romani historiography. By the late 19th century, concomitant with the establishment of the Gypsy Law Society, we also have growing scientific knowledge being accumulated by people who are convinced about the difference of races. And we're back to the idea of racial science and eugenics. And by the early 20th century, that's become established in Germany, in Scandinavia, particularly in Sweden, and other areas of Europe. And this biological knowledge, this biological categorization of peoples, with obviously white male Europeans at the top and black male Africans at the bottom, has come to influence a whole range of science which sees its culmination in the Nazi racial state between 1933 and 1945. And much of that still lingers in extreme nationalism and the rhetoric of neo-fascism in modern Europe today. When it comes to the writing of Romani history, the account through time of all that the Egyptians and the Romani people have done, what we find is that this is mostly produced by people from not within the community, but from outside of the community. Chroniclers, priests, court officials. And their records, of course, come with bias. They look at the world in a certain way, they look at their own community as the focus of their attention, and they look beyond their community to others who may either threaten or destabilize or enhance or enrich the experience of their own community. It's not until the 19th century when we start to hear Romani voices in plural, rather than the single occasions such as the one collected by Frescobaldi in 1384. In the 19th century, we start to get Romani voices telling their accounts of spirituality, the new forest Christian movement, the evangelical movement in England, the collections which resulted in George Borrow's missionary work amongst the Romani people in Spain and throughout England. This kind of account, which tells of people's experiences, Romani people's experiences and their contact with religion. By the time we get to the 20th century, of course, there are greater numbers of accounts. Sadly, some of them that come from the experience of attempted extermination of Romani people in the Second World War, accounts like those of Mateo Maximoff and others, those who survived the extermination camps and the experience of incarceration. The late 20th century sees a flowering of Romani people writing Romani history themselves, voices which seek a different perspective, one which doesn't come from outside, one which seeks to convey a sense of deeper meaning, of authenticity, something which attracts people to the idea that there is a genuine experience which is being related in a way that outside of the community will always be outsiders' views of the group within. The turn of the millennium is the point where we see the establishment of what Acton has called the new Romani history. Acton himself, Hancock, and myself, writing of Romani history which seeks a scientific basis in history and sociology, linguistics, ethnology, seeks to go back to the original sources in Arabic and Turkish and Persian and a multiplicity of European languages, but attempts to do so on the basis of from a Romani perspective rather from a non-Romani perspective in writing history. Now, there are significant challenges which have emerged when it comes to the new Romani history and Romani people producing their own scholarship about their own community. Like women or black people or minority ethnic communities anywhere, these things have been challenged. The idea that people from within a community can write about themselves with the necessary objectivity and scientific perspective has been very much contested, particularly by the established academic community around Romani studies, linguists, ethnologists, anthropologists, folklorists even. The key itself, I think, is a combination of both. There must be greater authenticity in the voice of Romani people, as there have been with women's history and with black history. There must be an acknowledged authenticity of representation, a genuine voice seeking to be heard. However, Romani scholars themselves need to make sure that they do work in ways that are unequivocally professional, things which are not myth being incorporated and pervaded as history. There needs to be an accountability to the kind of scholarship that is produced by Romani people, which will stand up to scientific rigour. This then is where we are now, in the early years of the millennium, 2020, and we are beginning to build what is a body of knowledge about Romani history, which we can call Romani historiography, which comes from within the community, to complement both that which went before, under Romani studies, but produced by non-Romani people, and that which might be considered to be flowering of gypsy lawism, but something that came with all the biases about 19th century views on race and ethnicity. This is where we find ourselves now. Thank you.